William Grafe, the Gambit man, takes his seat at the board. E4. E5. Knight F3. Bishop C5. The Bushcast Gambit on the board. On with the Gambit glasses. Hero pawn unlocked.
$1963, that's berserkable. I'm not sure why I didn't berserk last time. That's why I was a bit distracted. Okay, let's play this one. Nimzo counter gambit. Love this. Oh, should we do a pickler? Let's do a pickler gambit. Alright, so... Oh, this is going to be juicy. Let's go. Gambit glasses on. I think it's e4 we want to play here. So basically, yeah, I mean, they did a gambit with the King's Gambit, but we are letting them take all of this for some excellent development, and this diagonal is going to be brutal. It's going to be brutal. It's not really blockable, so it's going to stop castling for a long period of time. Now e4 takes... Oh, yeah, we're going to get our bishops out. All right, we're pinned here. I think a simple solution would just be like an 87, but I would also love to come here. No, I don't want to just drop that pawn. So yeah, let's just go like an 87, something simple. So we're going to make that knight move. I guess there's check, I didn't really see it. I guess check, there was takes or b8. Maybe we'll review this one after. Alright, well, let's castle out of here. If you want to take that pawn, it will be your funeral to crack open that file. Knight takes h7 is an interesting idea with the idea of going check and take. Could play not f5, this would be bad. Let's bring our knight into d4, that looks like a good square. So this one, we will now be down 3 pawns. Not to worry, we've got very good activity in exchange. Actually 6 if I want that. So I'm just not sure that I do. Let's just back up. I think it's still going to be very, very difficult to castle here if you're white. My next one's going to be rook e8. Almost no matter what. I'm just not going to hang mate here. Knight g5, I'll just go like knight g6, and rook e8. I want to get him on this file. Got all my pieces operating quite well. Honestly, I'm pretty happy with this. I think this is 3 pawns up, but very difficult to play, practically. They go after this bishop, I think my opponent's been defending quite well. I can grab their queen right now, although I'm not sure it's going anywhere. For example, takes knight g6, hits down this line. Let's take that queen. We did a smart thing letting it go there. Alright, we gotta checkmate rather quickly here. Not a lot of time to lose. They don't have many pieces working for him is the issue. Like, it's like they're down even more than what they're down. And yeah, we'll get them like this. With all of our pieces working well. They have bishop f1 to block. Okay, yeah, that was a nice win. That was a nice win. We can have a look at this, and actually, I'll take this opportunity actually to say a little bit more about this gambit that I really like. The Pickler Gambit comes out of the Nimzo counter gambit. Here, I'll expand this as much as I can to show you guys. Alright, well, yeah, let's talk about this. So, King's Gambit, I mean, if you accept the King's Gambit, then, okay, they'll play knight f3 to make sure you don't have queen h4 check. Queen h4, checks along here after you move your f-pawn, like by queen h5 or queen h4, can be very dangerous if this square is controlled by, like, a bishop or a knight or, like, a pawn. Otherwise, often check, like, you just get deflected unless you're, like, winning something. But in this case, black's threatening this, so white plays here knight f3. And then, I mean, if black does nothing, then white can recoup this pawn pretty easily. Although there's a lot of like really sharp continuations here and a lot of theory. What I like to play is this move d5, which is the Falkbeer counter gambit. So they can't take this pawn. They can never take this pawn because of check and taking the rook. So they need this pawn in the way of this path for the queen. So they accept this, and a lot of people here play e4, although your opponent's likely rather booked up on this, and they can try to challenge this pawn in the middle. I mean, there's a lot of theory here, but you can kind of see on the side here how common e4 is and how not common c6 is. So we're already talking about like a very few, oh my goodness, very few, sorry, I tried to zoom out. very few games, percent-wise, in this position. And it's a tough position for white to play, because f takes e5 being the second most common move here, as you see, would blunder the same exact idea with the rook fall. So the most common move, by a lot, 54% of games, is what my opponent played, dc6. And now knight c6 is perfectly playable, and black here now limits their pawn down to being 1. Again, never capture until white controls that square on e4 for the queen. And bishop c5 will come for black, and really, like that diagonal is just so brutal to play with. And so another option black has is the Pickler Gambit. So you can see 89% knight takes c6, but this really interesting move, bishop c5, and it allows white to take one more pawn. And as you see here, it's really tough. So again, takes, you cannot do it. Check will win your rook. So don't do that if you're white. If they play something like knight c3, I believe you can also just grab this pawn, threatening queen h4, and then, you could just start getting your pawns back very quickly. And white, again, might never, ever be able to castle. Like, it's very, very hard to ever get in d4 if you're white. And of course, that's just not something you want to allow. In the game, my opponent plays this move, knight f3, which is the most common move, and I think one of the top recommendations of the engine. Now e4, charging forward. So not e takes f4, because that no longer has the threat of queen h4, but e4 is now very annoying if you're white. So knight e5, I guess, would make a lot of sense, but I think just knight takes c6 here. Now if they trade, this is already, you can see it's just -1, and I believe we're following the most common lines here. Yeah, knight takes c6, trade, and here, so black is down just one pawn, and has a variety of ideas, including like queen d4 and queen f2. So for example, this is the most common move, and I believe queen d4 is a very good move here, but even just knight f6, threatening bishop g4, which would force bishop e2, like knight g4 can come, threatening knight f2, and like it's just all these issues, like here and here, f2 square is a problem, bishop g4 is coming. I mean, this is just a really, really dominant pawn and a really, really dominant diagonal that the pawn creates with being able to saw at any time. So not a good situation. I guess if they play knight c3, this could be even worse with like knight f6 and like knight g4 just coming and just killing them on f2. It's just really not fun. Like you can't castle here and you're not close to castling here. So what are you going to do with this diagonal? Just killing your king. So not a good position there. My opponent continued actually to play all the stockfish moves by playing this in c takes b7 here, throwing this in, hitting my rook. But unfortunately for them, so they played knight e5 here, engine 1, bishop b5 check, throwing in a development move. Knight e5 was not played in the game. If I here play knight f6, what I was just going to really do next, like you can imagine, like let's say check, I would go knight b7, I would try to castle, and I'd probably try to play like queen b6, hitting the bishop, and maybe trying to play bishop f2 at some moment here. And I don't know, I really like black's compensation. I think these bishops are really, really strong, and there's really nothing obvious for white to do with their king. Long castle is going to be very, very difficult to achieve. So in the game here, my opponent plays this move queen e2, which the engine doesn't love. So, but I don't think it loved my move either, knight e7. Oh no, it did. It liked knight e7 a lot. So knight e7, now reintroducing the threat of taking this knight by breaking this pin. I was a little bit concerned about queen b5 check in the game because it hits my bishops. But I guess here it's just not an issue. Knight c6, you can take either one of these if you're white. Takes here, I'll just take f3. And yeah, an even more not fun pawn to deal with. Let's see, like castles here. Like just keep it in mind, like we didn't sacrifice a piece, This is a couple pawns, and you're just getting no development if you're white here. Like this rook's just gonna come to e8, this knight's gonna come to d4, and all these things are just gonna be problems. It's just like black's king is so safe and white's king is so not safe. Like I would just rather play black 10 out of 10 times here. Ergo Proxy, what's up? Free-comer? Thanks, guys. And queen h5 check. As you see flashing in the engine, makes a lot of sense. Right. So I'll get back to that. I'll get back to what you're talking about there with queen h5, but let me, for continuity's sake, finish this game. So knight g5 was playing the game, which actually appears to be the engine's recommendations there. It didn't love queen b5 check, taking the bishop in exchange for this pawn wrecking havoc. So knight g5, it's looking at taking on e4. However, I say, okay, go ahead, take on e4. So the issue about this move is that, like, I think the rook's just going to come to e8. So yeah, for example, takes. This is the engine's line here. It's actually offering this rook, which is what a funny line. But okay, any knight move right now will win the queen. I have to ask about taking this rook. Knight d5 check. I guess okay, king d1 and knight e3 check. Man, oh man. And then there's just some mate sequence here in rook e1. Really, really nice stuff. Yeah, I mean, look at white's pieces. It's just not it. And I guess here, bishop e2. It's so funny. They can't even defend this. they can't even defend this knight c3. You just take that knight, and the queen is just nowhere to be found, and the king cannot castle out of this. So it's literally like white's just gonna get checkmated. That's so funny. That's so funny. Yeah, I think lines like that really underscore the potency of gambits like this. So in the game, yeah, knight takes h7 was something I was talking about, actually, with the idea of going check on the king and then taking the bishop. A pretty interesting trade. The engine likes knight c6, giving the rook to play knight d4, really trying to hit c2 here. So if white continues to try to defend that, oh my goodness, all the pieces pour in. You don't need this knight. Just all of black's pieces are just pouring in, and white's pieces just can't get off the first rank. Really, really funny lines. There's so much to explore here in the PICKLER Gambit. All right, let's try to keep this on topic in the game. So knight c3, my opponent's really trying to take this pawn, and I say, okay, go ahead. Knight c6, I want to play knight d4. They do take the pawn. I do get my knight to d4, which hit the queen, and also hits c2. This is theory. Yes, hello, Ned. This is theory for Anti-King's Gambit. This is the PICKLER Gambit. Let's go back to how we got here for continuity's sake. My game was e4, e5. My opponent played the King's Gambit. And instead of like accepting or playing, something kind of mainstream like d6 or whatever, I played d5. And instead of the Falkbeer Gambit with this move e4, the PICKLER Gambit being c6, because white can never take this pawn due to these checks and the rook falling at the end. So they took, I went bishop c5. And all of a sudden, this is an absolute killer diagonal, causing a lot of problems to white's king, including preventing castling, that can't really be blocked. In the game, knight f3, e4, hitting the knight. My opponent then threw in this, so now I'm down 2 pawns, because this pawn has now taken a few pawns before I was able to put it to an end, but my bishops are looking really, really good. In the game, queen e2, knight e7 to take away the pin. Knight g5, I castled, knight c3, so now they're looking at this pawn. I'm now bringing yet another piece into the game now, which is really not in the game, and knight c6. So they took my pawn here, and now I'm playing knight d4, so I'm hitting the queen and looking at taking c2. So in the game, my opponent plays queen d3. So already, actually, you can see the engine eval at minus 1.2. It's recommending just to give the queen. Just to give, like even the engine's like, we need some activity, we need some freedom, even at the expense of this. So knight takes b7, it's an interesting line. I gotta play queen b6, I gotta get this back. And, yeah, you need freedom. You need freedom, and white here has attained a lot of freedom, actually. It's not a bad haul. 2 bishops and 3 pawns for a queen. I feel like you can do a lot worse than that. 2 bishops and 3 pawns for a queen, especially, if your alternative is just a completely losing position. But, all the rooks are coming into the game now. I think that's why black retains the advantage here, is just because, white's pieces look like this. But if, this bishop could teleport to e3 or something, then I think, it could be worse. It could be worse, right? And here's my proof that it could be worse, is the game continuation. Because my opponent plays queen d3, hanging on to their now 3 extra pawns. 3 extra pawns on move 11, but it's already minus 3. Kind of a funny situation. Where, you have 3 extra pawns, it's not obvious that you're losing, and in fact, I play the best move here of just hanging on to my bishop. Just bishop b6, I just don't want to be taken. And it's you're up 3 pawns, I don't have, an immediate killer threat, but it's just, that's how bad white's position is here. Because I don't need an immediate killer threat when this king has no prospects of ever being safe. Because I keep this bishop on the board, it's, like I keep saying it stops castling. It stops castling, and this bishop cannot get out, so castling this way is not going to happen. So this king, the reason why I'm not in a killer rush, oh, I need to sacrifice this bishop here, is because white can play bishop e2 if they want, but they're not going to achieve king safety anytime soon. And my next move, as I was saying in the game, was going to be rook e8. So in the game here, knight a4, which is a very logical move, because I keep saying that this is, it gets 2 question marks. How well can you play in a blitz game? But it gets 2 question marks, but it's a very logical move, because I keep saying that this bishop is the cause of all of white's problems. What's the best? The best defense is king d1. The best defense is king d1, giving up on castling, and just saying, okay, I don't want to be completely toasted down this e line. But this position is still a complete disaster to play for white. It's just so interesting. It's 3 pawns up, right? It's just your development and your king safety is just bad. There's not an immediate obvious. It's almost hard to set up a position, right, where you're 3 pawns up. There's nothing immediate obvious why you're just going to lose right away. And getting an engine eval this high, right? But that's kind of what some of these gambits can do to you. It's not obvious that my opponent hadn't made a big blunder to this point. It's just really kind of dumb. And I hadn't played perfectly either, but it just kind of demonstrates, I think, how effective and practical these are. So knight a4 here, and I'm just playing rook e8. now, and I think one of the main issues with knight a4 and why the engine's not a fan, I'm just going to turn this off because it's really lagging on my computer, sorry. And I think we're already past the point here at -8 or -9. I think one of the issues of knight a4 is loosening the defense here. And now, like, this is just going to be like an absolute monster issue. And I think there's just, we've really reached the point of no return. I think the other issue is that the king can't even hide on d1, because I think in a lot of lines, an 83 check can come, and like using this pin on the pawn. So a lot of kind of fun things can happen here. But again, black's in no rush. Like, for example, like the knight moves, and black could maybe try to look at giving a check down this line, or like, you know, queen h4 could threaten checkmate here. Rook will come to d8, more discoveries here. Like, there's just nowhere to hide if you're playing white in this position. So in the game, knight takes b6, which makes a lot of sense. And I think if I play queen takes b6, I think the position's still equally completely winning, because this knight is just a blockade that just cannot stand, and the rook will kill this king, which has nowhere to run. But I think an even more effective way was what I did in the game, which was taking here. And my opponent doesn't take back, because, I mean, they could. But if they did, I was just going to play knight f5, which is winning the queen. And they cannot get 2 rooks for the queen. They can either take this one or take this one on e8. And if they took this one, then I was just going to take back, take b6, and then we're just up a lot of material. So like that e-line of, like, we kept the king in the center, and then we punished the king for being in the center by just castling, keeping our king safe, putting the rook on the open line. So in the game, bishop takes e4, they took on a8, I took their queen, take back, knight f5 check, and we're already at the point here. I'm looking at the notation, it says mate in 7, king f2 check. I had very little time, but it's almost better than being up. It's actually kind of interesting, because they have, if you just look at just the material, they actually have like a rook, bishop, and 3 pawns for the queen. Okay, granted, like the knight is toast, but I mean, it's just checkmate so quickly because my pieces are still much better than theirs, even after winning the queen. So this is already going to be checkmate. Took that. And again, I mentioned before the idea of queen h4 check, you have to control that g3 square. That's exactly why. That's exactly why it's an important opening principle. If you ever move the f-pawn, or if your opponent does, you want to know, control this square, because you can take that pawn because of the pin on this rook. And that's exactly what happened. I took the rook and then just came back and checkmated them. So yeah, that was that game there. We can talk a little bit more about Pickler theory. And I know I got this question specifically about this position. So knight e5, instead of giving the c takes b7 capture, right? Knight takes c6, and I believe the engine's top recommendation here is this move queen h5, which is not an obvious move to play. We're looking at it all the way down here at 6% of games. Plus, so many of those best engine moves are impossible to find. Yeah. I think sacking queen sack for piece activity being the best option, no intermediate or lower player would ever consider that. Yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of my point. Like you should consider that. Like, would you rather defend an impossible to defend position, or just sacrifice something just for freedom? You know, the same principle I'm using right now. Like I'm sacrificing pawns for activity for my pieces. It's so much better to play like that. I think white needed to kind of utilize the same principles in their situation, right? I think that's kind of a pretty instructive moment in this position. I mean, like, you know, you look at this position, if you're white, you say, my queen's attacked, I want to defend c2, so my 2 moves, I'm going to consider queen d1, queen d3. However, you can also look at it from the other perspective of, if I play queen d1 or queen d3, I'm not going to survive this. I'm just not going to survive this. Like, my king will never, ever be safe. I want to get to a position that I can play comfortably. And here, this opportunity can maybe present itself if you want to consider all the captures. I mean, okay, it's easy to explain finding a move in hindsight, but knight takes c5, I don't know. I hope I would have played it if I were right, but I don't know. I mean, I can't say for certain. But knight takes c5 here, knight takes b7. Yes, you lost 2 pieces for a queen, but you gained king safety. That's very important. It doesn't matter how many pawns you're up. Checkmate will end the game. So I think here you give yourself certainly a chance, and even if the engine didn't agree with this, it gives you some practical playability in that position. So I think that's a very instructive moment. That's something you should look for, both if in equal positions, and also if you're defending, to maybe try to, even if you have to give something back, anything to give yourself some activity. So knight e5, knight takes c6. Yeah, queen h5 is a really interesting move. It hits a lot of key squares. So one of those being the bishop, one of those, of course, being checkmate, and trying to recapture that knight. So it's a very interesting situation. Fortunately, black has their own queen, I guess, so they can defend f7 and c5 at the same time. And I guess if you're white here, you don't want knight f6 coming with tempo. So the engine, so here we can look at this again. So it's saying knight takes c6, and queen e5. So white here is able to force a queen trade. That's another thing you want to do if you're defending. You want to get queens off the board. It's very, very hard to just generate an attack on a king without queens, I would say. Like, once queens are traded, king safety was the most important thing with queens on the board, and now it's like the fourth most important thing, right? Like past pawns will decide end games, but king safety will decide middle games, right? And the difference being queens on the board versus queens off the board. Like, it's just like you imagine that same attack without queens, it's still doable. It's still doable, but it's just so much harder. So if you're defending, trading queens is a huge boon, even at the cost of development in this case. Like, white spent a couple tempi doing this, and we'll probably also have to take e7 for knight takes e7. And so like, for example, like, black can make a move here. And conversely, if you're playing black, I mean, a move you would consider here is probably bishop e6. I guess the issue is this pawn. So yeah, and queen f6 to not lose a rook, so you'd have to do that anyway, right? If you're playing black here, you don't want to trade queens, but I guess you have to. And the engine's giving this line, take bishop d4 to get your pawn back. This is absolute best play by white, and we get in this position where I guess white can keep their extra pawn. So kind of really interesting stuff. Obviously, as a Bushgas Gambit player, I face King's Gambits, because not everyone plays Knight f3. Some people try to Gambit before I do, but we can out-Gambit them with the Pickler Gambit or the Nimzovich counter Gambit. Very similar here if you just want to play Knight takes e6. That's also fine. You still want to play Bishop c5 as your next move and get them on that diagonal. But for me, personally, I definitely don't mind, and in fact, I'm even happy if they take b7 very often, because it would activate both bishops. Very Danish Gambit, Goring Gambit style. So, yeah. Shout out to the Pickler Gambit, and shout out to Jonathan Schrantz for putting the Pickler Gambit more on the map. I remember watching a video of that, of top 5 gambits you've never heard of. So I think that's very cool stuff. All right, well, subscribe if all that goes on YouTube. I'm gonna go back to the arena now.